everybody. Welcome back to the Guatemala Life and Culture podcast. It's episode 4. We're going to be talking about language and communication. My name is Jeff.
And I'm Dawn.
All right, Dawn, let's get into it. So this is probably one of the most asked about and most engaging sections of our Guatemala culture that people want to know about, because it's what you see the most. If you're at Walmart, if you're walking down the street, if you're at a school or a church, you're always going to have to deal with language. And we're going to hopefully dispel some myths about the local Guatemalans and language, and hopefully educate everyone on some new ways to engage that community.
It's going to be fun.
It is. Yeah. All right. So the first thing that we always start out with is Guatemala actually has multiple official languages.
It does.
In the United States, we don't have any official language, right? People might think it's English, but we actually don't have one.
Technically not, yes.
But Guatemala does. It is Spanish and 21 Mayan indigenous languages. And you might hear people locally say, oh, the Guatemalans speak a dialect of Spanish. That is not true.
Debunked.
Yeah. It is not a dialect. And you will even hear the Guatemalans themselves say dialecto or dialect.
Yes.
But the reason they're using that term is because so many of us Americans have used the term dialect.
We've incorporated it into their vocabulary.
Exactly. Yes. But what it is a completely separate language, and we're going to show you that on this episode. Yes. So, Dom, what are two of the main Mayan languages that people might speak here in our community?
The ones that we are most familiar with that we hear spoken are Ixil and Quiche. Not to be confused with the Department of Quiche, it's just spelled differently. So there's a language, Quiche, as well as a region or department, but Quiche and Ixil are the two most common Mayan languages in our community of Dover and New Philly, mainly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we'll delve a little bit more into those here in a second. But for those of you listening, again, there are visuals associated with this. We are video recording this. So we are going to be referring to some visuals that you can access on a link that you can find on this episode when you're able to safely do so if you're happen to be riding in a car.
Yes.
So one of the things is Quiche. One of the common ways that you'll see Quiche spelled around here is actually spelled like quiche. So it's Quiche. That is not the official way to spell Quiche. And if you're trying to do any research or find out information about the language, I would encourage everyone to spell it the correct way, so you actually get the information you need instead of a bunch of photos of quiches,
right?
Which does happen.
It does happen.
Quiche is spelled K''I''CHE.
Yes.
All right. And Ixil, the other language Don referred to, is IXIL or IXHIL. And,
correct.
I actually, before we get more into this, I have a quick story about when I worked at the schools. I had an individual that worked at the schools that, God bless her, was really trying to interact with the non-English speaking students and their families. And she came to me one day and she was so excited because a lot of these Mayan languages aren't written, at least not in, it's more of an academic written, or not a lot of people know how to read and write it who do speak it.
Right.
So she was so excited because she came across like this Quiche dictionary, and she started, learning words from it over the past few days. And then she showed me what she had found. And it was actually the language of Quechua, which is spelled, I'm not even going to try to spell it right now, but it's similar.
It looks close.
Quechua is actually an Incan language from Peru in South America, not a Mayan language. So because it looks similar, Quiche and Quechua, she thought she had found it.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's a completely other language.
Great intentions, but
great intentions. So let's get into it. So one of the first things is, especially if you work in any sort of school or medical office or anywhere where you're coming across these Guatemalan names, you're going to see a lot of X's at times. And even when Dom was saying the language Ixil, and then I said that it was spelled with an X, people might be like, what the heck?
Yeah, yeah.
So the X in the Mayan languages or in a Guatemalan name actually makes the SH sound. So if you have the name that's spelled Ixcoy, people might pronounce it Ixcoy.
Ixcoy?
It's actually pronounced Ishkoy. Or one of my favorites is the last name you might see Box, or they might say Juan Kalel Box.
Yes.
It's like, no. It's Bosch.
Yeah.
Right?
It is.
And you can't blame anybody, right? Who would have thought that would have been the case? But if you do want to start to interact with the community and make them feel comfortable and start to build that trust, one way is being able to pronounce names correctly, because they're going to be like, wait, wow, you actually said that right?
Yeah.
So anytime you see an X, replace that with the SH.
Funny story. Last school year, I work at the high school, New Philly High School, and there was a teacher who has been learning, maybe through more of our personal development talks about Guatemalan life and culture over the years. And, little by little, you start to incorporate those things, which is great. And this teacher was so excited to tell me that he was just confirming this student's last name is pronounced Bosch. And sometimes, you get like Bosch, but that's the general idea. And he was then kind of flabbergasted that the student corrected him and said, no, it's Box, because my assumption was she was just so used to correcting people, or just say it the way it makes sense to you. Like, I'm used to it,
Yeah.
And sometimes it is like a rule of 3 where you re-ask just until you get the right answer, because someone might be just being polite or thinking they're showing respect by not correcting a teacher or someone in authority. But I was happy to see that this instructor was so excited that they were saying it the right way.
Yeah.
So they needed a pat on the back. They're like, you did it. That is how you pronounce it. Yes.
And that's a great point, because we talked about the respect for authority, right? And you do see numerous examples of the names becoming anglicized or Americanized.
Yeah.
And you're right. They assume that maybe we can't pronounce it the right way, or it's just easier than having to, have to tell someone multiple times how to say it correctly.
Yeah.
And, you're absolutely right on that.
It happens all the time, but it's just, something that takes a lot of practice, because it is like, for an English speaker, it's a new, just learning names is just a whole new skill in itself. Yeah. So,
well, and there's another, and this is another story. There's going to be a lot of stories in this one, because there's a lot of experiences with this.
Are fun. Yeah.
But the name Araceli, Araceli. It's amazing the amount of people that cannot pronounce that name correctly. And you hear it Araceli, kind of like an Italian twist to it.
Yes.
You hear Araceli.
Yeah.
There's nothing more American or northern than using the and something,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, yes.
But anyway,
unfortunately.
And I am familiar with someone with the name, and the reason I bring that name up is because she, on so many occasions, has politely corrected someone where they ask her name and she says Araceli, and for whatever reason, they just can't repeat that back to her. And so she's just kind of given up in some ways of like, you know what? It's just easier not to correct people, kind of to your point.
Exactly.
So she'll never introduce herself with the incorrect name, but she's not going to.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, afterwards she'll be like, oh my gosh, they mispronounced it again. I'm like, we get it. I know.
Right. And she speaks English. So it's not an polite thing to, for her, she would be culturally aware that it's okay to correct someone or tell them how your name is. But that's a tough spot.
Yeah. And there's even some students, whether it's because they're embarrassed by their name possibly, or because they think it's so hard to pronounce, they just kind of change their name altogether.
Yeah.
And they become Freddie, or
Yes.
Can't think of any other examples off the top of my head, but you do see that. And another question that we get is, why is there so many names? How does that work? How does that identify this is the brother of this person or the daughter of that person? So to answer that question, what happens is, and again, we have a visual up here for those of you watching. You have dad, mom, son, and daughter. So typically you have the first name, and then you have a middle name.
Yeah.
And then there are 2 last names. Those 2 last names are a combination of the mother and the father, typically. Now, there's a lot of cases where this formula isn't followed.
Sure.
And you can't, and I always say, anytime I talk to people, you cannot go off of a name and say who's related to who. You just can't. Mm-hmm. And it has nothing to do with being a mixed family necessarily. It's just, it just is what it is. Mm-hmm. For instance, I know one family, they have 3 kids. 2 of the kids have the same 2 last names. The third kid has a different second last name. Mm-hmm. And there's no real reason for it. Yeah. It's just, but they're all biologically related to each other. Same mom and dad. So don't read too much into names as far as relations go. Correct. But back to the 4 names here. So dad, mom. So the son, let's say son's first name is Santos. Mm-hmm. And the last name is Mejia Sica. Mejia would be dad's last name. So typically, traditionally, the dad's last name is that first last name of the child. And then the second last name would be mom's first last name.
First last name.
If you're listening to this, I encourage you to look at the visual when you get a chance, because it will make so much more sense than listening to this.
Once you understand it, it actually makes more sense in your own brain than writing it out. Like you're like, okay, like paternal name, last name first, maternal last name second. So just kind of in the same sense, taking on the dad's name, but we just still keep the mom's name typically, pretty commonly. And then, for the children, if their parents are the same, it would follow that order. And
you might be asking, well, if, the parents are together, wouldn't the mom and the dad have the same last name? Well, again, in this case, traditionally, they don't really change their names. They can, and there are cases of that happening. Again, it just depends on the couple, but a majority or a large part, they might officially be married, again, going back to not being able to tell relation, but their last names are different still.
Because they're still keeping their parents' last names.
Yes. Yeah. And so to kind of wrap all of that section up is the middle name. And there are some funny stories of this. So in our culture, our middle name might be in memoriam of another family member or something that just kind of flows with our first name that our parents give us, but we're never really going to be referred to it very much.
I think my name is short. So, Dawn Marie is sometimes what my mother calls me, and not just for being in trouble at all, because that is typically the stereotype, right? You're only called your full name when you're in trouble. But I think just because it's shorter, flows together. Some people closest to me call me by my first and middle name as just a term of endearment. But yes, often it's just a side note. It's not really that important. Typically. However, in Guatemalan culture, it is often the favored name or preferred name. And this is a question that is always asked respectfully in registering students for school. A question on an official form is you have all the names, the legal names, but then what is your preferred name? Because we want to call you by what you answer to. And I've said it before, but I'll say it again. The rule of 3 comes in handy because you might not get the right answer the first time. What is your name? I have a student who's Victor. His first name is Victor, and we've been calling him Victor for a while now. And then last year he decided, my name is Wilson. And you're like, well, what do you mean your name is Wilson? Well, that's my middle name. And I actually do go by Wilson. So sometimes it takes a while for that to be communicated. This is what I actually go by. And for whatever reason, it is common in Guatemalan culture for your middle name to be your preferred name.
It's flip-flopped from us.
Exactly.
Right?
Just opposite. Yeah.
And to kind of play off of that, the funny stories come from mainly like Head Start, preschool, kindergarten, where
young kids,
a young kid starts school for the first time, and let's use the name Santos Joseph Mejia Sica.
Yes.
Let's say that's the full name of the student. And he starts school, and the teachers, calling off names, or maybe on the desk, they have the name already for the child, and maybe the little cubby hole, and it says Santos. Well, because the family named Santos might be grandpa's name, and that's who they're kind of giving
Referring
respect to him
yeah.
and referring to him. But what he's called in the home and by everybody that he knows is Joseph. And so when he goes to school and the teacher's like, hey, Santos, and this has actually happened.
This has happened many times.
And they're like, why is he not responding? Because he doesn't know or hasn't been used to being called Santos. He is Joseph.
Yes.
And so once they change that up, they're like, oh my gosh, like he's responding fine.
Light bulb. Yeah.
So it's just one of those kind of lost in culture moments, which
Absolutely.
It can cause a lot of frustration and confusion. But once you know, it's like, oh, well, this isn't that bad.
And it's really, it is once you have a relationship of trust with someone, that's where you'll get, in anything. But going back to the school example, like we have the lady who takes care of registration, who speaks Spanish, does a great job. And we have our typically first period English teacher who speaks Spanish. In my experience, as the liaison aide who kind of walks along with students through all these processes, I get to know them pretty well in a more informal way. I'm not their teacher. I'm not their, the lady at registration. I'm just like hanging out with them, accompanying them to the cafeteria, stuff like that. And so teachers or administrators will ask me for the real scoop, because they'll be like, I have Juana. Now she told me she goes by Maria. Is it Maria or is it Juana? And usually if I ask, I'm not, just saying I always know the answer, but you can tell, like when you have a relationship with someone, you're like, it's fine. It doesn't matter to me if you want to be Juana or Maria. I mean, if you just want to pick whatever name, then we might have some issues because you can't just invent whatever name.
I'm Billy.
Yeah, exactly. Or let's just make it official. But if you do, have something of a rapport with someone, they will hopefully be comfortable enough to tell you, my name is whatever your preferred name is. But it sometimes takes some patience. It takes some persistence. But it is frustrating when you just feel like from the get-go with a name, you're not getting anywhere. That's a frustrating place to be at, but understanding. And I've seen it happen too, where people will now proactively ask, what is their full name? So at least you have a groundwork to pull from.
Yeah.
Okay. If it's not Santos, it's good to know Joseph is a name in there that might work.
Yes. And I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the other things I would encourage people to do as well is there's this inclination to want to shorten these names automatically, like drop one of the last names. Yeah. Always ask first. That might be perfectly fine with the individual if you do that, but don't try not to get into the habit of just dropping a last name because it's cumbersome for you, because it is their name, right? And so it's always okay to ask, like, hey, do you want to go by both last names or one of these last names? Especially when you get into sports, maybe if you are putting the name on the back of a jersey, do you want the hyphen or do you want the one? So it's okay to ask that.
Yes.
And One of the other things we said, the X makes the SH sound. Also, the J typically makes like the or the soft
Like an H
sound. So if you have the name, gosh, yeah,
That's the one I hear the most. Yeah.
It's not Ajanel. It is Ahanel.
Yes.
It is not Mejia. It is Mejia.
Mejia.
Exactly. And one of the ones that just cracks me up is in this day and age, you would think the name Jose would be something that people, even if you don't know any Spanish or anything, you'd be like, oh, that's Jose. But the amount of people I've seen, you say Josie, I'm like, oh man. Anyway, again, in anything, not just Spanish or Guatemala, anyone you come into contact with that might be of a different culture or language, it's okay to ask.
Oh yeah,
totally okay to ask and find out. So let's get back into Quiché and Ixil. And I'm going to play a video here that really shows the difference and that they are different languages, not dialects. So let's go ahead and start off here.
Uts, good, bueno. Uts, good, bueno.
So here, the word for good is uts, U-T-Z.
In Quiché.
In Quiché. And in Spanish, it would be
bueno.
Bueno. So uts, bueno. Completely different, right? So the other thing that we have is, how are you? So in Spanish, everyone listening or watching, how would you say, how are you in Spanish?
¿Cómo estás?
¿Cómo estás, right?
Muy bien.
So in Quiché, it's awutzawatch. In Ixil, it's comptale. Comptale, awutzawatch, ¿cómo estás? Completely different. So whenever we get into talking about communicating with the Guatemalan community, a lot of them can speak Spanish, but that is probably their second or third language that they speak.
Yes.
So it's not going to be always at a super high level. And we see this with interpreting. You might have a native Puerto Rican speaker or a Mexican, Dominican, or wherever. Cuban. Yeah, exactly. And maybe they're interpreting at a hospital or at a school or just informally somewhere else. If they're speaking, rapidly in Spanish, it doesn't guarantee that this Guatemalan individual is going to understand necessarily any better than English. Maybe a little bit, but there's been occasions where I've been with families where they've gone into appointments. They've had an official interpreter. Yeah. Don, you are an official interpreter, so I'm sure you have some stories.
I do.
But you have people that don't understand the culture and just assume that the Guatemalans understand Spanish completely well.
Yeah. And
the families come back out, and I'm like, so how'd it go? And they're like, I don't know what they said. Right. And they had an interpreter.
Yes. And when it comes to the point of, do you have any further questions?
Yes.
No. Well, because, what questions could I possibly ask other than, can you do that all over again? Or so it is, it can be very interesting. It's not Spanish. I equate like a lot of different experiences with, not knowing the level of Spanish literacy or accent, purely that, just accent, like across the board, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Cuban, Honduran, Guatemalan,
that
Mexican.
Would be your dialects. Like when people will say dialect, that might be more of what they mean and what people would think of. Like, there might be a few words here and there that are different for the Guatemalans, but for the most part, it's the
Spanish,
same.
But it's really, you deal with so much slang in certain different places, countries. So I use the example of like, say you have someone from the deep south of the United States and you have an interpreter from like New Jersey. So totally different, right? And there are a lot of words that they'll probably throw out, explaining things that we just do differently from place to place. So it's not always understood.
Well, and to kind of go along with that, went to Ireland, and they speak English in Ireland. It is a different form of English. You know, I can understand everything that they say, but my first day there, I got picked up at the airport by a family. We went to this restaurant. We sat down. A gentleman named David was talking to me, and I actually had to pause him. I'm like, David, I really apologize. I don't understand a word that you're saying to me right now. Like, you know, there was the noise in the restaurant, and he was talking, and it took me 2 or 3 days to get used to the cadence and the terms and all that. And then I was fine. Then I could understand everything. But that is more of like what people, I think, assume when they think of the Guatemalans speaking Spanish. It's just a little different. It might take a little time. Different language.
Very, very different.
Very different language.
Yes.
And to do another audio portion of that, I just want kind of people to listen to this a little bit. This is a Quiche cartoon, and obviously not necessarily going to understand what's being said, but when you're out in public and you're listening to a Guatemalan speak with other Guatemalans, listen and see if it sounds like this, because it's going to be a little more guttural, a little more sounds than the fluid romantic language of a Spanish, right? So this is kind of what it would sound like.
Yashak ako. Sa tawuyo wal chawem chikuyu no ma. Amak el hekabif. Kasiwi chinakuyu. Yash pantaha umal.
Has tahinki bano?
Shukam elo hirafa ishuk ako.
All right. So if you're just listening, it's a little cartoon of a little brother broke a sister's toy and dad comes in. But if you heard that, you could tell it doesn't, even if you can't speak Spanish, it sounds different. It sounds different. One of the other things too is in Guatemala, when they are in school, and we will be talking about education in a future episode, they learn in Spanish and in their Mayan language.
Yes, both. Yeah.
Both. So when I visited some schools, and there's some visuals of this as well, you can see 1 or 0 through 9 on the wall, and everything that's hanging on the walls is all in Quiche.
Yes.
So there's the word utzapatik, which is actually bienvenido, or welcome. And then, so I think most people can count in Spanish to at least 3. Uno, dos, tres.
Oh, yeah, at least.
Right?
Yes.
So in Quiche, it would be hun, kib, oshib. And I could be butchering that majorly. But again, we're just trying to hammer home that this Guatemalan population, Spanish is not their primary language.
Right.
And so going back to the interpreter thing, having an idea of the culture, slowing words down. And so, Don, I wanted to ask you, one of those cases when a family came out of an appointment and didn't understand really what was happening or what the next step was until I looked at the paperwork. I'm like, oh, they needed x-ray.
Yeah.
So in Spanish, how would you say the word x-ray?
You could say it one of 2 ways. I mean, I would say radio X or radiografía would be both correct. Yes.
Awesome. So those are technical terms. And if anyone who's tried to learn a new language, you might be able to have a basic conversation, but when it gets into technical language, you might fall off a little bit.
Sure. Yeah.
So if a family's in an appointment and the next step is getting an x-ray and they heard the term
radiografía,
right? And that's what is interpreted to them by the official interpreter of Spanish, they might not necessarily understand what that is. And in this case, they didn't.
Yeah.
And so when I had to try to explain to them in a Spanish that they would understand, it was foto de los huesos.
Picture of your bones.
Picture of your bones, right? That's not a super like official way, or, you know.
It's not a, medical terminology. It's just the explanation.
But when I said that, they got it. And that's what I would encourage anybody who's working with the Guatemalan population is just be conscientious of that. Like, if you're the person who's using an interpreter as a professional interpreter, you are saying what is said. You don't have the liberty to really say what you want.
Right.
So always try to know your audience. Ask their level of fluency in Spanish. That's not offensive. Because if it's their second or third language and you don't have a Quiche interpreter present or a Shil or a Huacateco or whatever, just use language that is more descriptive.
Correct.
I don't like the term dumbed down because it's not dumbing it down.
Exactly the same thing. It doesn't mean you have to necessarily speak in a way that would show that maybe someone is hearing impaired. You know, the stereotypes that we think, speak louder, speak slower. Not necessarily, just use plain language. Plain doesn't mean dumb either. It's just simply, what is it? And that's often, I mean, I do that when I first started working as especially a medical interpreter. That's really where you see the more, not the educational, in the educational setting, it's less professional. It's just less informed. It's more informal. And, but if I'm in the room with the X-ray technician or the ER provider, doctor, whoever, and they will blurt out all of these terms that are very medical, I will just advocate and say, can you explain that, please, to the provider? And I'll say that in Spanish. Podemos explicar esto más to understand? Can we explain more to understand better? And then that opens the door to like maybe some questions or clarification.
Absolutely, because there's still that respect for authority that we've talked about numerous times, that maybe they don't feel it's their place to question.
Absolutely.
That, but they absolutely can. Yeah. And another example from an educational setting is IEP meetings.
That's exactly what I was thinking of. Yes.
If it's all in English and you're an English speaking person, I still don't know what's being said half the time unless it's more descriptive, right? Yeah. I mean, when you're saying like your child's fine motor skills, blah, 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 I mean, you can translate or interpret that, but what does that still mean?
Yes, exactly.
Right? So just kind of use that as an example.
Yes.
For it. Moving on here, another example is a lot of people have questions about, the translation apps. And I guess since I just used the word translation, what is the difference, Dawn?
Great question.
Between interpreting and translating?
So often, very common misconception, a translator or translation is a document or what are the forms? Written. Form. Yes, any form that's written. A translator is a person who purely works on changing the language of any type of written documentation. An interpreter is the speaker. So
spoken.
That's the very big difference. Yeah.
So it's one of those things, no one's going to care if you use the wrong word. But interpreting, spoken, translation, written.
And interpreting as a definition also more so means not the word for word translation, but you're interpreting the meaning, like the real meaning, instead of word for word. So if you use an idiom or something in your speech as the interpreter, instead of just saying like,
it's raining cats and dogs.
It's raining cats and dogs. Thank you. Yeah. I as an interpreter would say, which means,
it's
and explain. Yes, exactly. Not just because if you just put those words out there, it's like, huh?
Yeah. And anybody who's served overseas and whether it's for missions or in any other way, and you've used an interpreter or given a speech, you've been through that.
Oh, yes.
You've been through that doesn't hit home culturally.
No, there is a difference. Yeah.
So translation apps, interpreting apps, they are very helpful. No one's going to deny that, but they also have their downfalls. So if you're using it for an official capacity, if you're sending things home for school or medical, it should not be through a translation app because they're not that reliable.
Right.
However, if it's something more informal, like if you're a teacher and you're trying to get hey, this is what's coming up for our classroom, or that's totally fine.
Sure.
It's those official documents or things that really need to be known.
Yeah.
Anything medical should probably never be Google translated or any other app.
Right. I always, part of my job at the schools is, I mean, a lot of teachers or any staff member will email me or just in person hand me a flyer. Like just the other day, I got a flyer for like, QT dance clinic. And there were just a few things that I said, okay, I would change this and this. And that's it. So that as long as it's proofed, that's fine. That's where the translation tool comes into place. Yeah. You definitely can put it through Google Translate for the ease of copy and paste.
Then you can just kind of tweak it from then on out,
because sometimes it might just be something in the middle, like words that got squished together and then that they don't make any sense. Right. It's much easier to proof and look over as long as you can send it on to someone who will be able to do that.
And the other thing as well is you have the idea of proper nouns. So this is the names of places. Keep those in English.
Keep them in English.
Because a lot of the times our Guatemalan community, the only way they know of that place is through the English term.
Right.
So if you're changing, let's say west, or let's say south, South Elementary, there's a Dover and there's a New Philly South, both school districts, right? Yeah. So if you say, if that's translated to say Escuela de Sur,
South School.
It still says South School, but that could be a little confusing. But if you just said Escuela de South,
yes,
they're going to know what
Dover
that means.
South, just South. Yes,
it
is known as New Philly South Elementary. Yeah,
exactly. So that's just kind of another little thing to keep in mind. Yeah. And so we have another visual here. This is a text message. And again, I encourage you to look at this if you're not able to at the moment. There's slang,
yes,
as we have in English.
Absolutely.
There's autocorrect. So if you were to take something that was texted to you or written to you and plug it into a translator, it still might not come out because of the slang. So in this instance on the screen, it's AKO is the way that they spelled it in Spanish, but it actually is aquí, AQUI. They use the letters XK, which is shorthand for porque.
Why?
So if you were to plug that in, you wouldn't get anything.
Right.
So that's another downfall of the apps.
Oh, yes.
That you have there. And then the other one at the bottom of the visual, there's Hola, ¿qué estás haciendo? But if you were to see it right now, it's spelled OLA, and then continues on, and then the last word is siento, SIENTO.
Yeah.
So this is someone who literacy is a little lower,
right,
and maybe they're even doing voice to text, possibly.
Oh, yes.
And so when this is sent to me, if I were to plug that into a translator, it would say, wave that you are a feeling, or something like that.
Yeah.
Makes no sense, but you almost have to play mag apps and be like, I'm going to say it, not look at it, and realize they're trying to say, hola, ¿qué estás haciendo? Which is, hello, what are you doing? Like, oh, okay.
I get it. Yeah.
But I wouldn't have gotten that with an app.
No.
And for our Guatemalan population, another term that they'll say is otro lado, or means like the other side. Yeah. Typically, that's in reference to just another town or another state. When you're asking them where something is, or where, otro lado. It could be Guatemala.
Absolutely.
It could be Dover.
Yes. That's on the other side.
It could be Sugar Creek. You just you'd have to ask that.
It refers to basically like a different place, more so than just like, over there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Somewhere different.
It's kind of like when if you're ever overseas and you're like, or, I mean, maybe even in the United States, and you're like, where are you from? How many people are, I know I'm not going to say New Philadelphia right off the top of the
Exactly. Yes.
I'm going to say Ohio.
Yes.
Right. Or if you're overseas and you say Ohio, they still might not get it.
Right.
But you can keep narrowing that down as you find out how much the person actually knows.
Right. Yeah.
Typically, I'm like, we're in between New York and Chicago, right?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So this quote here from Bennett and Allen, to kind of start to sum up our language portion here is the person who learns language without learning culture risks becoming a fluent fool. And to me, I love that quote because it does sum up everything that we've talked about in regards to you can know a language,
Yes.
but if you don't know the culture and the nuances of that culture, you're still not going to be able to connect with them. And so with any business, school, medical facility, really anywhere that is looking for interpreters or translators or looking for someone to help bridge that gap, make sure that they understand the culture of the population that you have.
Right.
You know, if it's Mexican, great. If it's Cuban, great. If it's Guatemalan, because it might not do you any good at all to have that interpreter if they don't understand the culture that they're dealing with.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So Donna,
I was just going to add that language is words primarily, but it's so much more than that. Yeah. And I think of my own experience of how I learned Spanish, which was unique and best for me. You know, I didn't learn in school where, we have great Spanish teachers, but that's a whole different experience to learn from an Anglo speaker, a different language. But I was living in Chile, but Chileans have a very strong accent and leave off consonants. And, that's more Spain, yes, but still say different. It's very different. But I leaned on the Ecuadorians, Colombians, Peruvians, Bolivians, who had a more soft, smooth way of speaking that was just, for me, learning for the first time, much more understandable. But yeah, culture is like such a key component. So when you speak about, talking to someone from a certain country, it's more than just, like Spanish is a blanket national language, so much more than that. Yeah, there's so much different culture that's rooted in the language that is really fun to learn. But yeah, so just adding on to that, like it's knowledge is one thing, but experience or the context of the culture that's where it really comes into play of real understanding.
Slow is fast in this case. Yeah. It's, going back to our first couple episodes, knowing where they come from, asking like, oh, you're from Guatemala. Are you from Aguacatan? Are you from Neiva? Oh, do you speak Quiche, Ixil? Doesn't mean that I can speak it.
Sure.
But laying that foundation, like, oh, last name's Ishkoy. Great. You're building that connection with them so that you're building that trust so that you can get to where you need to go. And just kind of wrapping up this episode with this is a lot of times people have fear of like, I wanted to go up to this person. I want to introduce myself, but I'm not sure whether they're going to find that offensive.
Sure.
Do it.
Yeah.
The whole part of bridging the gap and creating a community is both sides of that gap need to go a little further. Step outside of your comfort zone. If you want to use your Duolingo Spanish on someone, on your neighbor, on someone in Walmart, it's okay to say, hola, ¿cómo estás?
Yeah. They're
not going to be offended.
No.
Smile, right? Body language, something we didn't really talk about, is huge.
True. Yeah.
Huge. Keep that smile on your face. Remember that you're going to look foolish trying to speak their language at times, the same as they're going to do. And you're in it together.
Absolutely.
And that's going to make them more comfortable to try and use their English. So Don, you have anything else?
I think we've covered it all for today.
Covered it
Jeff.
all. All right. So again, thanks for listening to this episode. Our information is in the link. I encourage you to check out the visuals if you weren't able to look at those as we went through the episode, and also to reach out to us. If you have any questions or stories of instances where there was a language snafu or maybe how you might be able to implement better communication in your place of work or your place of worship, please reach out. We'd be happy to walk through that with you. So until next time, have a good one.